In the humid air of Belém, as the Amazonian breeze swept across the COP30 summit grounds, world leaders gathered under one theme: climate justice through shared responsibility. The Democratic Republic of Congo's President, Félix Tshisekedi, took the stage before an audience of global policymakers, scientists and activists. His message was firm and sobering. The promises of climate finance made to poorer nations are still not being met. He spoke of a widening gap between the rhetoric of developed nations and the realities faced by vulnerable countries that bear the brunt of environmental degradation. During this time, financing remains insufficient, fragmented, and often poorly targeted. I call for a rebalancing between financing for mitigation and that for adaptation, said President Tshisekedi, his tone calm but edged with urgency. The Democratic Republic of Congo, often referred to as the second lung of the planet after the Amazon, holds one of the world's largest rainforests, a natural shield against global warming. Yet, Tshisekedi reminded delegates that the DRC and its people gain little from the mechanisms designed to reward environmental stewardship. Despite absorbing millions of tons of carbon dioxide, the Congo Basin receives a fraction of the funding channeled to wealthier carbon markets. He pointed out that countries like his face a paradox. They are guardians of essential ecosystems but remain among the poorest on Earth. The costs of protecting forests, building resilient infrastructure and transitioning to green energy fall disproportionately on those least responsible for emissions. For Tshisekedi, this imbalance underscores the failure of global climate finance systems to live up to the commitments made in Paris and Glasgow. He described how fragmented funding models create inefficiency. Climate aid is often tied to bureaucratic conditions, slow disbursement, or donor preferences that do not align with national priorities. For many African nations, funds for adaptation, the measures needed to protect communities from floods, droughts, and shifting agricultural patterns remain severely underfunded. At COP30, where pledges and negotiations dominate the headlines, Tshisekedi's intervention reminded participants of what's at stake beyond the conference halls. The DRC, he said, is both a victim and a solution provider in the climate crisis. Its forests, wetlands and river systems serve as carbon sinks, but unsustainable mining, illegal logging and poverty threaten to undermine that balance. His call for rebalancing was directed at the world's wealthiest economies, urging them to fulfill their financial obligations under the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. That principle, enshrined in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, recognizes that while all nations share the burden of climate action, not all have contributed equally to the problem. Tshisekedi's remarks also carried a sense of frustration familiar to many leaders from the global south. Despite repeated promises such as the $100 billion annual commitment first made in 2009 to support developing nations, delivery has been inconsistent. Funds earmarked for adaptation remain a small fraction of total climate finance, with mitigation projects often favouring renewable energy in middle-income economies taking precedence. For the DRC, this imbalance is not just theoretical. In the country's eastern provinces, torrential rains have triggered deadly landslides, displacing thousands. Droughts in the south have crippled agriculture. Meanwhile, the country's forests, vital for carbon absorption, face encroachment from communities desperate for income. In this context, Tshisekedi emphasized that adaptation financing is not charity, but an investment in global stability. Without resources to cope with environmental shocks, he warned, millions could be forced to migrate, intensifying humanitarian crises and regional insecurity. The president's statement came as the COP30 summit in Belém, hosted for the first time in the heart of the Amazon, focused heavily on implementation rather than pledges. For African nations, this meant turning verbal commitments into tangible projects that strengthen resilience on the ground. Tshisekedi underscored the need for financing that directly reaches local communities, bypassing cumbersome international intermediaries. Observers noted that his speech aligned with a growing coalition of African, Latin American and Pacific Island states demanding structural reform in global climate finance. These nations argue that the current system privileges donor control, often defining which projects qualify for funding, and in doing so limits innovation in adaptation and sustainable land use. Tshisekedi also tied the issue to broader economic fairness. The DRC, rich in cobalt and other minerals, essential for green technologies, stands at the crossroads of the global energy transition. Yet, he noted, while the world races to secure critical minerals for electric vehicles and batteries, Congolese communities see little of the resulting wealth. Environmental degradation from extraction adds another layer of injustice. His speech echoed calls made by other African leaders in previous COP meetings that the global climate response must go hand in hand with equitable development. Clean energy transitions should not replicate the exploitative models of the past. Instead, they should empower local populations through technology transfer, fair trade, and inclusive investment. Tshisekedi's remarks drew attention not only to the inadequacy of financial flows, but also to the quality of those flows. He argued that grants and concessional loans are preferable to debt-based mechanisms that burden developing economies. Several African nations already spend more servicing climate-related debt than receiving adaptation support. This cycle of borrowing to survive the effects of a crisis we did not create, he implied, is morally indefensible. His words resonated deeply across the plenary hall, particularly among delegates from small island states who face rising sea levels and intensifying storms. The message was clear. Adaptation is no longer an option. It is an imperative for survival. As the camera panned across the hall, the expression on Tshisekedi's face reflected both determination and fatigue. For over a decade, leaders like him have raised the same concerns. Yet, despite scientific consensus and growing awareness, financial mechanisms remain slow, politicized, and skewed toward mitigation in developed markets. In Belém, the symbolism was powerful. The Amazon, a region that mirrors the Congo Basin's ecological significance, served as the perfect backdrop for Tshisekedi's appeal. Both rainforests face accelerating deforestation and share the challenge of balancing conservation with economic need. Throughout the summit, side events focused on forest protection and indigenous rights highlighted the same issue. Without stable financing, promises of sustainable development will remain hollow. The DRC's government has proposed regional carbon markets and partnerships to monetize ecosystem services, but such initiatives require global trust and oversight to prevent exploitation. Tshisekedi's speech also hinted at the potential for South-South cooperation alliances among developing nations to pool resources, share technologies, and strengthen negotiation power in global climate forums. This approach could shift the dynamic from dependency to solidarity. As applause filled the hall, Tshisekedi concluded with a renewed call for urgency. The DRC, he said, stands ready to contribute its natural wealth and ecological expertise to the world's climate goals, but not at the expense of its people's dignity and development. His intervention at COP30 captured the heart of a broader debate that has defined international climate politics for years: how to align environmental protection with justice and equity. It also reaffirmed Africa's moral authority in demanding that those most responsible for emissions shoulder their fair share of the costs. The message from Belém was unmistakable. The fight against climate change cannot be won on promises alone. It requires resources, trust, and the political will to transform lofty commitments into measurable action. Tshisekedi's words served as both a critique and a roadmap, a reminder that climate finance must move beyond numbers and reach the lives of those it is meant to protect. As the summit continued, delegations broke into smaller sessions to debate new frameworks for adaptation funding and resilience partnerships. Yet the echo of his statement lingered, a quiet insistence that without fair financing, the world's climate ambition will remain a hollow dream. For the Democratic Republic of Congo, and for the millions living along the Congo River, the stakes are existential. Each delay in funding, each unfulfilled pledge deepens the vulnerability of nations that have contributed least to global warming. Tshisekedi's intervention ensured that, at least for a moment, the world was reminded of that reality. In Belém, amid the dense humidity and the sound of rain against the canvas roofs, one message cut through: climate finance is not a favor, it is justice long overdue.
Pendant ce temps, Les financements demeurent insuffisants, fragmentés et trop souvent mal ciblés. J'en appelle à un rééquilibrage entre financement de l'atténuation et celui de l'adaptation.